Good evening, everybody. My name is Don Richards, and as Matthew said, I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Trust. First of all, I'd just like to confirm that I'm really pleased that the Trust was able to provide excellent clinical services again throughout the difficult pandemic period, and we did that while balancing income with expenditure for the second year in a row. And we also made some significant improvements to our infrastructure, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later on in my presentation. Next slide, please. So the headline measure of our financial success is the ability to contain our revenue costs, our day-to-day costs within income made available to us. And I think most people will know that in the 21-22 year, we were still working within a financial regime that fixed the amount of income that we had available to us, but we still managed to contain our costs within that fixed level. And this slide shows that we earned £481 million worth of income, and we contained our costs to 480.5 million, giving us a surplus, as I say, for the second year in a row. If I could take the next slide. So just looking at income, first of all, in a bit more detail, this graphic just illustrates the point that our income change for the 21-22 year wasn't a great deal different, only 2% different to the previous year, 2021, but that in the 19-20 financial year, that income was 22% more than the previous year. I'll just go into details on the next slide. So this next slide provides a little bit more detail, and it shows where our income changed, and you can see on this slide that the main change was around the sources of income that don't come from commissioners, where we were able to recover sources of income that were restricted early on in the pandemic. So charges to other organisations, rental income, car parking income and so on increased significantly, while income from NHS commissioners was relatively stable. And in fact, within that, income specifically targeted towards managing the costs of the pandemic were reduced as the effects of the pandemic were reduced in the last financial year. So if I could have the next slide, which turns to look at our revenue expenditure. And as you'd expect, if we balanced our income and expenditure, then our costs increased modestly as well. And you can see in this graphic, we're saying that our costs only increased by 2%. And just looking at the next slide, one of the most useful indicators of our financial health is the amount that we spend on agency staff. Now, we've commented in previous annual general meetings that in the 2015-16 financial year, our agency costs were as high as £36 million. And that by the 2021 financial year, through improved processes, improved recruitment and retention, and Andrew McMenemy will talk a bit more about successes there, we managed to get our agency costs down to as little as £12 million. But last year, our agency costs for the first time in the last 6 years rose to £14.9 million. But it's important to note that 5.3 million of the 14.9 million were driven by the pandemic, by the effects of the pandemic. I could take the next slide, please. Okay. In this slide, you can see that apart from agency costs, the largest area of cost increase was a 12% increase in our clinical negligence costs. Now, these costs are driven by the need to increase contributions to the NHS Litigation Authority, which settles the amounts for clinical negligence episodes several years in the past. So this is one of the challenges for the Trust. continuing to manage our cost base to be able to afford the contributions that we are required to pay to the NHS Litigation Authority. You can also see that our employers' pension costs increased as well, while other costs increased relatively modestly. Happy to move on to the next slide. So the balance sheet remains relatively healthy in the 21-22 financial year comparison to 2019-20. We ended the year with a cash balance of £37 million and boosted the value of our fixed assets through capital investment to nearly £300 million. And that's quite significant in comparison to the value of our fixed assets in 2019-20. Next slide, please. So this graphic just highlights the fact that in the 21-22 financial year, we set yet another record for capital investment. Anybody who knows the West Herts Trust knows that we desperately need to invest in our buildings and in new equipment, and we invested £65 million last year. So the next slide provides a graphic illustrating the relative proportions of our capital spend. And you can see the largest proportion last year was the unmissable feature of the site, which is our new 1,300 space bright yellow multi-storey car park. And that significantly improved the experience for patients, visitors and staff when they come to Watford General Hospital. We invested £15 million in information technology infrastructure, and Paul Bannister will talk more about that, but the most significant element within that was implementing a new state-of-the-art electronic patient record. We also bought 2 state-of-the-art and surgical robots. We refurbished Watford General Hospital theatres, progressed plans for the future redevelopment of the trust across all 3 sites, improved fire safety, and continued to make inroads into our backlog maintenance bill. So if I go to the next slide. Thank you. This slide provides the detail on the amounts that we've spent against each of the capital themes. And you can see in the graphic on the right-hand side how we've increased our capital expenditure year on year over the last 3 years. So I'd just like to end by thanking the collective West Herts workforce for going beyond the norm to make the 21-22 financial year yet another hugely successful financial year. And with that point, I'll hand over to our Chief Operating Officer, Sally Tucker.